Okay, let's continue our discussion of ecosystems, focusing on carbon dioxide, in particular the way in which we seem to be impacting the carbon cycle. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have been burning significant levels of fossil fuels, and since then the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have been increasing. And this is what's known as the Keeling curve, and I believe it was 1958, Charles Keeling began measuring directly the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere out in Hawaii. He chose Hawaii because he wanted a place that he thought would have relatively clean air. He's seen since then that those CO2 levels have been steadily increasing with a seasonal up and down pattern. Why does it go up and down? Well, in the spring and summer, the levels come down because plants in temperate areas are coming out of dormancy and putting out their leaves and taking in a lot of the CO2. But then in the fall and winter, they drop their leaves, and those leaves decay, and so the levels go back up. So they just go up and down with the seasons with this continuous increase. Now we can measure them further back in time, or we can get estimates from further back in time from data from ice cores and such, which give us an idea of the past. Some folks are studying the effects of CO2, elevated CO2. Here are this is what's called the FACS-1 experiment. These folks out at Duke University are taking these forests, and these are rather large rings of these structures that pump out CO2. And so they're basically elevating the CO2 levels in particular parts of the forest and seeing what happens. Well, CO2 is, of course, used in the photosynthetic process, so you would think if you increase the CO2 levels, you can increase the rate of photosynthesis and the rate of primary production. And that can happen, but of course CO2 is not the only thing that plants need. They need water and other essential nutrients. And so you can have situations where the CO2 levels are elevated, but they don't necessarily grow any faster because there are other things that are limiting plant growth. CO2, of course, is important in the greenhouse effect. The atmosphere has certain gases in it, CO2, water vapor, methane, that act as greenhouse gases and basically hold in heat, which is a good thing because it makes the Earth a place we can live on. Otherwise it would be really quite cold. But of course it's thought that this effect is being magnified by the increase in the CO2. Some would say, well, if we're increasing CO2, the plant growth should compensate for that and just take up that excess CO2, but the Keeling curve kind of demonstrates that that doesn't appear to be happening. Another issue is ozone. The ozone layer is up in the stratosphere and blocks out UV light, which is good because it makes the surface of the Earth a place we can live. Now, there are certain compounds that we have produced in the past, in particular ones called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and other things like methyl bromide, which is a fumigant used to kill insects in certain farm fields. These compounds that have chlorine and bromine in them, these gases, can get into the stratosphere, and what they do is they break down the ozone. And because they are very reactive, there's a dynamic process high in the atmosphere that converts oxygen gas into ozone because of sunlight, but then this basically reverses the process and again can decrease those levels of ozone, and so therefore more of the ultraviolet light gets through. The decrease in ozone is not occurring uniformly around the globe. It's worse in some places than others. In particular, in the southern hemisphere, you get a seasonal increase in this ozone hole that can extend over places like the southern tip of South America and Australia, where you have people living, as opposed to Antarctica, where there aren't very many people. Lots of penguins, but not many people. But again, this UV light that gets through can be damaging to cells, to the phytoplankton, etc. in these areas. And so because of this process, a number of these compounds have been banned and are being phased out because of the damage they do to the ozone. Okay, that's it.